to tell you the truth, I actually wasn't expecting this kind of performance out of this little mini PC. Now, God of War is a newer AAA game that's definitely hard to run on these lower end PCs, but as you can see, this little thing is trucking along. What's going on, everybody? It's ETA Prime back here again. Today we're going to be taking a look at a really interesting mini PC that I recently picked up on AliExpress. Now, I always do searches every other month for new mini PCs hitting the market, and this one definitely popped up on my radar, and I knew I had to get it. This is known as the F11 Edge, and I picked this up on AliExpress from a company called TonTop, and they do sell a bunch of different mini PCs, but I don't think they're the original manufacturer of this because I have seen other sellers with this same listing. But we do have some pretty interesting specs when it comes to these mini PCs because we've actually got a dedicated Nvidia GPU in here. It'll also support a 5G connection with the correct module, and given the form factor, we've actually got a lot of I/O here, and we could add more down the road due to the motherboard layout. Now, inside of the box, obviously, we're going to get the mini PC. We also get some rubber feet for the standoffs, some extra hardware to mount a 2.5-inch drive, along with the cabling and mounting bracket, plus we've got a VESA mount and a 90-watt power supply. Before we go over the specs and jump into some testing, I wanted to give you a quick look at the internals here. They do offer a few different variants of this. I picked up the bare bones model, so I did have to add my own storage and RAM, but you can pick this up to 64 gigabytes of RAM and I think 2 terabytes of storage. But in here, we've got a nice little layout. It supports DDR4 SODIMM RAM up to 3200 megahertz. It's got 2 M.2 slots, plus we can add that 2.5-inch drive with all of that mounting hardware and cabling that they sent along with it. It's got an odd little cooler layout, and that's because it's actually cooling the CPU and the dedicated GPU that's on the board. This is actually using an Nvidia Geforce MX450, and it's the 30.5 watt version, so it's the most powerful version that they released, and I believe it clocks up to around 1850 megahertz. Now, it's not the most powerful dedicated GPU on the market, but we should be able to get some gaming out of the way. And when you compare this GPU to something like the Radeon 680M iGPU, it does beat it out in a lot of games and even in benchmarks. But, with those 680M graphics, they are paired up with a more powerful CPU, given that the Ryzen 6800U, 6800H, and even 6900HX is an 8-core 16-thread part. But with the F11 mini PC here, we've got 4 cores and 8 threads. Now, when it comes to I/O, up front, we've got 2 full-size USB 2.0 ports. And from the motherboard, we could actually add 4 more USB 2.0 ports. We've got enough headers, we just don't have enough room on the case. Moving around back, we've got our power input, gigabit Ethernet, 4 more full-size USB 2.0 ports. We've also got 2 full-size USB 3.0 ports, 2 full-size HDMI ports. We've also got audio in and out, and USB Type-C. And this port here is where it gets a little weird because in every listing that I've seen for this F11 mini PC, it states that this is a Thunderbolt 4 port, but for the life of me, I cannot get it to work as a Thunderbolt port. It does work as a full functional USB 3.2 port. We can do display out, but unfortunately, I just don't think that this really does support Thunderbolt or USB 4. And for me, I think that's a big letdown because I did want to test out an eGPU with this, but when it comes to the specs, for the CPU, we've got the Intel i7-11370H, 4 cores, 8 threads, and this was before they did the performance and efficiency cores with the 12th and 13th gen. Base clock of 3 GHz and a turbo up to 4.8. We've also got built-in Intel Iris Xe graphics, that 30-watt Nvidia Geforce MX450 with 2 GB of dedicated GDDR5 VRAM. This will support up to 64 gigabytes of DDR4 at 3200 megahertz. We've got room for 2 M.2 drives, 1 2.5-inch drive. I've added a Wi-Fi 6/Bluetooth 5.2 module, and I'm going to be running Windows 11 Pro. And so far, it's actually been a pretty snappy little system. I mean, we've got 4 cores and 8 threads here on that 11th gen i7 Intel CPU. We can change the TDP from the BIOS if you wanted to. Out of the box, it's set at around 45 watts. Taking it up just a bit more does help out with those boost clocks. But I'd say the most interesting thing here is that Nvidia MX450. Now, you'll see laptops on the market for around $850 paired up with this same CPU and same GPU combo. I think Dell, Lenovo did it. I actually reviewed an Asus with a lower end MX450. I think it was their 25 watt version. And in that little laptop, it was paired up with the Ryzen 5 5500U. Performance wasn't bad, and with that MX450, it did outperform Vega graphics. But now that we've got Ryzen 6000 in these mini PCs, that's really what it's going to be compared to. And I can tell you right now that in certain games, this MX450 does outperform the 680M. And in terms of using this as an everyday desktop, it would work out great. You could definitely get some 1080p video editing out of the way on this. 4K video playback's great. And by the way, we've got a 4K 60 HDR video right here. This is using the built-in Intel Iris Xe graphics. We don't even have to touch the dedicated Nvidia card to do 4K at 60 with this machine. I will move over to my game capture in just a second so we can get a better look at this, but I wanted to test out a couple games here and show you what's going on, and performance here is actually way better than I thought it was going to be. Forza Horizon 5, 1080p, medium settings with SSAO off. I usually like turning this off with lower end GPUs and iGPUs. We can get an average of 75 FPS out of this game with it set up like this, and if you take a look at Afterburner, you can see that our GPU clocks are at 1900 MHz, so we do have a little bit of boost. And the only other time I've ever tested the MX450 is in a laptop, and I believe it was the lower wattage version, but we've got the 30 watt version here, and since we're not confined by, those power limits of a laptop and heat constraints, I think this is kind of stretching its legs a little bit. Now, it's still far from a high-end GPU, but with games like this, it's actually performing really well. Moving over to God of War, 720p, original settings, and FSR set to balanced. I know we're not on an AMD platform, but it's just basically resolution scaling. But usually, when I'm testing this out on, let's say, Radeon integrated graphics, I turn FSR to performance, and with it set up at performance, we can get an average of around 79 FPS out of God of War. For a mini PC, I think this thing's doing a great job like it sits, but there are other games that we need to test, and I also want to run some benchmarks on this system. So the first one is Geekbench 5, and you gotta remember, we've only got 4 cores and 8 threads, but single core is looking great, coming in with a 1420. Multi does leave a bit to be desired, given that we've been testing out 8-core, 16-thread CPUs for a while now. But it did come in with a 5482. Moving over to some GPU benchmarks with 3D Mark, we've got Night Raid coming in with a total score of 23,670. And when I run this on, let's say, the 6800U at about 35 watts, we get a 26,032. Now, the GPU on this MX450 was beating out that 680M, but the CPU with that 6800U just has more oomph to it. I mean, we've got those extra cores and newer architecture. Checking out Firestrike, we got a total score of 5,380. On the 680M, 6,470, and the graphics are now beating out the MX450. And finally, we've got Time Spy, 2,585, on the 680M at about 35 watts, 2,731. So when it comes to synthetic benchmarks, the 6800U with those built-in Radeon 680M graphics is beating this whole little system out, but let's get into some real-world gaming and see what happens here. Go. And first up, we've got The Witcher 3 1080p low settings, and by the way, this is the new DirectX 12 version. We are using dynamic resolution scale. I think it is scaling it down to around 720p, but it's very playable like this, and we've got it set at 75 FPS. Next up, Injustice 2, had to throw one fighting game in here. 1080p medium settings, and going into this, I didn't think we'd have an issue with it. To tell you the truth, I'm pretty sure we'd be able to take a lot of these settings up to high 1080p. I just left it at medium, and we're not having an issue running this whatsoever. So overall, this little system is going to handle these fighting games quite well. Street Fighter 5, Mortal Kombat 11, and we can go up to 1080 with it. You probably saw this one coming, but we definitely had to test it out. GTA 5, 1080p, normal settings. We can get an average of around 84 FPS out of this. I know it's an older game, but it's still a lot of fun to play. And we could probably take some of the settings up to high here. I just left it at normal to see what it would do, and we get an average of 84, which is definitely playable on a little system like this. Here's Cyberpunk 2077, and when it comes to these lower end GPUs, we definitely have to drop some of these settings down and the resolution. We're at 720p low settings, and we're getting an average of 69 FPS out of this. We can run this at 1080, but you're going to have to lock it at 30 to 35 FPS. I figured we'd get a little better performance out of Doom Eternal, but unfortunately I did have to drop this down to 720p. No dynamic resolution scale, we're at low settings, but I was hoping we could do 60 FPS at 1080p with this. Unfortunately, we only get an average of around 54 at 1080. I also wanted to test out Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Unfortunately, I muted the unit while it was playing, so I didn't record the sound. But we're at 720p, balance preset with Nvidia scaling. It was able to be turned on from the settings here. We got an average of 91 FPS, a low of 54, and when it comes to that Nvidia scaling, it was set to performance. And finally, we've got Spider-Man Miles Morales. Now, I was pretty impressed by this, but unfortunately, we do have to lock this at 60 with dynamic resolution scale set to 60. If we try to overrun this little GPU and CPU combo, this kind of falls on its face. We only get an average of around 54, but with VSync on, we can get a constant 60 out of this game at 720p low settings. Another thing I wanted to take a look at here was total system power consumption. Now remember, this comes with a 90 watt power supply, and I think we could use at least a 120 with this. At idle, this thing pulls 16 watts. Average gaming, 74 watts, and this is at the stock TDP. We can still take this up a bit on the GPU and CPU. And the maximum that I could get this to pull was 88 watts from the wall. So with a little bit of overclocking or some TDP adjustment on that CPU, we will need a larger power supply, and I think 120 would be perfect for a little system like this. Another thing I was worried about with this mini PC were CPU temps, given that the GPU and the CPU are cooled by that same system inside of the box. But at idle, we averaged 38 degrees Celsius, gaming 78 degrees Celsius, and within 4 minutes of running Cinebench, this did hit thermal throttle at 91 degrees Celsius. But under everyday normal use, I didn't hit thermal throttling, and even gaming was great, given that we had that average of around 78 degrees Celsius. So far, it's turning out to be a pretty capable little system. Now, one thing that really disappointed me was the fact that they do advertise this with Thunderbolt 4, but I cannot get that port to work as Thunderbolt 3 or Thunderbolt 4. Might be a driver conflict, but the way it looks right now, I don't think it's running at those Thunderbolt speeds. I think it's only USB-C 3.2. Now, if anything changes, like I find a way to get this to work as Thunderbolt, I will post it in my community section, but I am planning on doing at least one more video with this. I want to do some MX450 overclocking, and I can do some TDP adjustment on that 11th Gen i7. I know we can get better performance out of the CPU and GPU, but I also have to take a look at the CPU cooler here, or the CPU/GPU cooler. If I was to up the wattage on that CPU, I'd probably want to repaste this thing. I mean, I'm just using it factory spec right now, but putting some Noctua might help out. And we can also adjust the fan curve from the BIOS, which will make it a bit louder. And the way it's set up right now, it's actually not bad. You can hear it, but it's not like a jet engine. It's not like some of the other mini PCs that we've taken a look at on the channel. And I might have to, up that fan speed to keep it cooler, taking the TDP up to, let's say, 65 watts on this CPU and overclocking that GPU by, 100, 150 megahertz. But that's going to wrap it up for my first look video at the F11. I'd like to know your thoughts about this little mini PC in the comments below. In the end, I would probably still go with a 6800H or an HX mini PC with USB 4. That way we could connect an eGPU. They're really not that far off, but when we're talking about I/O, this thing is loaded down, and there's actually more that we can add from this motherboard in here. But yeah, I'd like to know what you think about this little thing down below, and if you're interested in learning more, I will leave some links in the description. But that's going to wrap it up for this one. Like always, thanks for watching.